She stood barefoot in the dirt, dust clinging to the hem of her torn dress, and waited as if the world itself had forgotten her. The sun beat down on Dry Creek, turning the saloon sign into a glare she could barely look at. Men laughed nearby, tossing coins and calling out prices as though she were no more than the bay mare tied behind the livery. Her hands ached from the ropes, her heart even more. She swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the horizon where the red hills blurred into the afternoon haze, wondering if anyone would ever see her as a person, not a debt to be settled. Somewhere on the edge of town, a cowboy watched quietly, hat pulled low, and for the first time in months, she felt a sliver of hope stir inside her. Would the world ever let her choose for herself, or was she still just another thing to be traded and forgotten? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. Arizona Territory, 1888. The heat had settled over Dry Creek like a heavy quilt no one asked for. Late afternoon, when the sun turns mean and the shadows grow long, the dust hung thick as breath. Even the horses stood still, ribs rising slow, as if waiting for something they didn't want to see. 19 years old, and they sold her for a bay mare and a handful of coins. That was what the blacksmith muttered under his breath as he hammered the last shoe into place. His anvil rang, sharp and cruel, slicing through the low talk of the men gathered around the yard. Lila Hart stood barefoot in the dirt, toes half buried like she wanted to sink into the earth and vanish. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope. Her dress, once blue, was torn at the hem, dust-stained, hanging on her shoulders like it, too, had given up. Jed Crowley, her stepfather, stood a few feet away, boots spread, chest swollen with the heat and the pride of a man who had nothing left but his meanness. Look at her, he barked to a pair of ranch hands leaning against the fence, strong enough to haul water, young enough for company. Don't get no better than that. They laughed. Men often do when they don't want to look directly at cruelty. One of them poked at Lila's arm with the end of his glove. She talks, cooks, don't complain, Jed said. You boys ever get tired of the saloon girls? This one'll mind the house. Lila didn't lift her eyes, didn't give them anything. Shame had a way of teaching silence early. A few yards off, by the livery post, stood Caleb Roarke, tall, weathered, hat pulled low. He looked like a man who'd seen enough of life to know better than to get involved in someone else's trouble. His bay gelding flicked its tail at flies, while Caleb leaned one shoulder against a post, arms crossed, saying nothing. Jed noticed him and grinned, showing teeth stained from tobacco. Roarke, you've got sense. You know a good deal when you see one. How about it? He jerked his thumb toward the girl. Trade you the girl for that bay of yours. I'll even throw in the saddle. A ripple of laughter drifted through the yard. The blacksmith shook his head, kept hammering. A dog barked once, then hid behind a water trough. Caleb didn't move. Came here for iron shoes and nails, he said at last, voice flat. Not for buying trouble. Jed spat into the dust. Trouble she's worth twice what that horse is. I raised her, fed her, sheltered her. She owes me. Lila's eyes flickered just once, but she kept her gaze down. Whatever she thought, she buried it deep. The ranch hands shrugged, uninterested now that the fun had drained away. Jed turned to another pair of men, shouted out his offer again. They laughed, prodded, then waved him off. Crowley's face darkened. The way desert storms gather without warning. Fine, he growled. Last offer you give me that horse. I give you the girl. No refunds. No returns. Someone snorted. Someone else whispered, "Man's desperate." Another said, "That girl must have done something," as if any reason could justify it. Caleb finally lifted his head, his eyes gray. Tired met Lila's for a split moment. She didn't flinch. She simply looked hollow, emptied out like a well after a long drought. He turned away. "Not my business." Jed stepped toward Lila, grabbed her by the arm. "If no one's buying," he hissed loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'll damn well take what she owes me back home." Lila stiffened like someone struck her. For the first time, she spoke barely more than a breath. "Please, don't let him take me back." The yard went still. Jed yanked her hard, forcing her to stumble. "Shut your mouth." Caleb pushed off the post slowly. Something in his expression shifted, nothing dramatic. Just a tightening at the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. The kind of change only a man who's known grief understands. He walked to the corral, where his bay gelding waited, ran his hand along the horse's neck. The animal leaned into him, quiet and loyal. He didn't look at Jed when he spoke. "All right." Jed blinked. "All right, what the horse?" For the girl. Caleb's voice was steady as a fence post. "But you don't come near her again." Crowley grinned like he'd just won a riverboat hand. "Deal, blacksmith. Draw up a paper just so we keep things legal." The blacksmith sighed, wiped his hands, and scribbled something on a scrap of ledger paper. Jed signed with a flourish. Caleb scrawled his name with a careful, reluctant hand. A few men laughed under their breath. Others looked away. No one stepped in. Caleb walked to Lila. He took out a small knife from his belt and cut the rope around her wrists. The fibers fell to the dust. He didn't touch her more than necessary, didn't crowd her, just stepped back and said, "Come on." Lila didn't move, at first. Her legs trembled under her. For all she knew, she'd just switched cages. Caleb helped her onto the gelding's back, lifting her gently by the elbow. She sat stiff, hands clenched on the saddle horn, breath thin as thread. Jed pocketed his coins with a self-satisfied grunt. "Pleasure doing business," he called, swaggering off toward the saloon. "Best trade you ever made." Roarke Caleb didn't answer. He took the reins, led the horse away from the yard, away from the laughter, away from the dust thick with judgment. Lila didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the horizon, though her vision blurred at the edges. As they left Dry Creek behind, she swallowed hard. Because there are worse things than being sold. One of them is not knowing whether the man who just bought you saved your life, or claimed it. Twilight came slow over Dry Creek, bruised purple along the edges, like the day had taken a beating. The wind had died down, but the saloon sign still creaked as it swayed on rusted hinges. That sound followed them as Caleb led the bay gelding out of town. Lila perched stiff in the saddle, like she wasn't sure the horse would tolerate the weight of her fear. Hoofbeats fell steady on the packed earth. Thump, thump, thump. Leather straps creaked with each step. The mesquite branches whispered dry secrets in the wind. The world was quiet in that lonely way. The West often was too wide, too open, too honest. Lila kept her eyes forward, though she couldn't see much beyond, the sweat-darkened mane. Her hands were clasped on the saddle horn, so tight her knuckles whitened. She could still hear the men laughing in the livery yard, could still feel the rope burns around her wrists, could still taste the bitterness of being traded like a mule nobody wanted. Caleb walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other hanging loose. He didn't speak for a long time. Maybe he didn't know how. Maybe he didn't want to scare her, or maybe he was a man who simply preferred silence. "You hurt anywhere?" he asked at last, voice low and even. She swallowed, throat dry. "No." "Crowley ever hit you?" he asked, still not looking up. "Yes." He nodded once, not angry, not pitying, just acknowledging a truth she didn't want to say out loud again. He tried another question. Hungry? No. She wasn't sure if that was true. Hunger and fear felt too similar now to tell apart. A few minutes later, the gelding shifted under her, and Caleb reached up to steady the saddle strap. The movement was small, harmless, but Lila flinched so sharply she nearly lost her balance. He paused, didn't touch her again. "Easy," he said. "Not gonna hurt you." She nodded, but her pulse didn't slow. Her body had learned its lessons too well. Hands reaching toward her always meant something bad. They rode past the small, whitewashed chapel on the hill, its steeple leaning slightly, like it was tired of praying for this place. Beyond that, in the distance, she saw the faint outline of Fort Ransom, the old cavalry post, low stone walls, a flag moving lazily in the last light, and then a hill with wooden grave markers, some tilted, some collapsed. No names she could read from here, just the kind of markers people put up when they didn't have time for coffins. The sight hollowed her chest a little more. Caleb glanced up at her briefly, maybe noticing the way she shivered. "Gets cold after sunset," he murmured. She didn't answer. The evening breeze touched her bare arms, and gooseflesh rose immediately. A mile later, without a word, Caleb shrugged out of his coat and lifted it toward her. She stared at it like it was a trick. "Take it. Temperature drops fast out here." She hesitated only a beat before she slipped it around her shoulders. The coat smelled faintly of horse and pine smoke. Warmth bloomed across her back, surprising and unfamiliar. "Thank you," she whispered. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. They traveled like that for another long stretch. The light faded until only a red band clung to the horizon. Coyotes yipped somewhere far off. A single star cracked through the darkening sky. By the time they reached Caleb Roarke's ranch, night had settled. The land around it was 5 fenced acres, pressed up against the Red Rock Hills. A sagging barn leaned westward, like it had one good storm left in it. A chicken coop sat half-tilted behind the house. Smoke drifted from a metal chimney, faint but comforting. "This is it," Caleb said. "Ain't much, but it's home." He stopped beside the hitching post and held the horse still. Then he stepped forward, hand lifted, halfway toward her, before he froze, reconsidered, and let his arm fall. "I can help you down, if you want." Her breath caught. She hated that she needed help. Hated more that she didn't trust any man's hands, not even his. Still, her legs felt weak. She nodded. He moved slow, giving her time. His hands barely closed around her waist, just enough to steady her as she slid off the saddle. Her boots touched the dirt, and she swayed. He stepped back immediately, giving her space like it was something fragile he didn't dare disturb. "Let's get you inside." The front door opened with a soft groan. Warm lamplight spilled across the threshold. The house smelled of wood smoke and coffee, sharp but comforting. Inside was simple: a square table, a pot-bellied stove, a narrow bookshelf with a few worn volumes, a tin of coffee on the counter, a coat hook, a kettle, a pair of boots by the hearth. It wasn't tidy, but it wasn't unkind. Then she noticed the closed door at the end of the short hallway. Beside it sat a small pair of children's boots, dust-covered but neatly placed. Caleb saw her looking and cleared his throat, awkward and rough. "That used to be my boy's room," he said softly. "You don't need to worry about it." He wiped his palms on his trousers, then pointed to the opposite end of the hall. "There's a spare room down there. Used to be my sister's when she visited. Beds made. Window faces. East." She followed him. The door creaked open, revealing a tiny room, a narrow bed, quilt tucked tight, a small dresser, and a hook on the wall where a dress might hang. It was the cleanest room she'd seen in years. She touched the quilt with trembling fingers. It felt unreal. Caleb reached into his pocket, then set something small on the dresser. A key. "Door locks from the inside," he said, voice careful. "You keep the key? Nobody comes in unless you say so. Not even me." She stared at it. A room. A door. A lock she controlled. It was more freedom than she'd held in her hands since childhood. He stepped back toward the hall. Before leaving, he said quietly, "You're not a horse. You're not a debt. You're just here. That's all." Then he walked away. Boots soft on the wooden floor, Lila picked up the key. It felt heavier than iron, heavier than the past, maybe heavier than everything she'd been told she was. She closed the door, waited, then turned the lock. Click. The small sound rolled through her like thunder. Morning came gentle to the Roarke ranch, sliding in through the thin curtains like a shy visitor. Lila woke to the faint smell of coffee, drifting through the floorboards and the soft knock of a hammer outside. For a moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling beams, tracing old knots and splinters in the wood. No shouting, no slamming doors, no heavy boots pacing the hall. Just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural to her, too soft, too unguarded. She eased herself out of bed, pulled Caleb's oversized coat around her shoulders, and padded to the doorway. Through the front window, she saw him, Caleb, out by the corral rail. The sun caught the dust rising at his boots as he worked, fitting a new post into the ground where the old one had cracked. He moved with a slow certainty, like a man who didn't need to rush anything anymore. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms scarred by years of work and weather. The steady thunk of his mallet echoed across the yard, mixing with the morning birds and the restless stamping of horses. Lila let her hands fall to her sides. Unsure what to do with herself, she had spent years moving only when ordered, punished when she guessed wrong. Now she was in a house with no rules spoken aloud, no demands, no eyes watching her every breath. She wasn't sure that was easier. She wandered into the main room. Sunlight touched the shelves, highlighting a thin layer of dust on the few belongings he owned. A tin of coffee sat half full beside the stove, lid dented, but polished by frequent use. 2 plates rested on the single shelf above the counter, edges chipped from years of meals too quiet to leave a mark. A faded shawl soft, with tiny stitched flowers, sat folded on the back of a wooden chair. No one had moved it in a long time, the kind of stillness that belonged to grief, not neglect. On the mantel above the stove sat a picture frame turned face down. Lila reached a hand toward it, fingers trembling with a curiosity she didn't quite understand. Something in her wanted to see the face inside, to know who had lived here before her, to understand what pain lingered between the walls. But just as her fingertips brushed the frame's edge, she stopped. Some doors weren't hers to open. She stepped back. When she turned around, she noticed the hallway, 2 doors, one open, one always closed. Her room had felt safe, small, and warm, like a borrowed kindness. But the closed door at the far end felt heavier, like a kept secret. She waited until Caleb's hammering drifted toward the barn before creeping down the hall. The door wasn't locked. It gave easily beneath her hand. Inside, the light was softer, filtered through a lace curtain, stiff with age. A narrow bed sat against the wall, made neatly but covered in dust. A child's dress, yellow once, now pale and worn, hung from a nail at the footboard. Its hem fluttered slightly in the draft. Lila's breath hitched. On the wooden floor, near the window, lay a small carved horse. Its paint had long faded, though a trace of blue clung to its flank. One leg was broken clean off and rested beside it, as if someone had set it there, intending to fix it someday, but never had the heart to try. She knelt slowly, fingertips brushing the toy. The sorrow in the room pressed against her like a hand on her back. A board creaked behind her. She froze. Caleb stood in the doorway. His hat hung loosely in one hand. Dust smeared his shirt, but the look in his eyes, steady, tired, aching, struck her harder than any shout would have. Neither spoke at first. The kind of silence that comes when two people realize they've crossed into a tender place. Finally, Caleb's voice came low, roughened by memories he didn't share often. "That was my boy's." Lila rose to her feet, slowly placing the toy back where it had been. "Name was Thomas," Caleb continued. "Liked horses more than most men do. Used to run around this place with that little wooden thing clutched in his fist. Wore the paint off it by the time he turned 4. His hand lifted slightly, almost reaching into the air, then dropped. Fever took him, and his mama, 4 winters ago." Lila's breath caught. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what words a man deserved when he stood in a room that still held the shape of his heartbreak. But she whispered anyway, voice softer than the dust on the floorboards. "I'm sorry." Caleb didn't flinch. Didn't steel himself like some men do when grief is noticed. He just nodded once, his jaw tense. He stepped into the room, picked up the carved horse with careful fingers, turning it as if expecting it to move again, to gallop across the floor the way his boy once had. The toy creaked faintly as he set it back in its place. When he looked up, his eyes glimmered wetly before he blinked it away. "No need to be sorry," he murmured. "Life's taken its piece out of both of us. I reckon—" He stepped past her, back into the hallway, shoulders heavy but steady. She followed, closing the door gently behind them. Neither said another word. That night, they ate in silence at the small wooden table. Caleb sipped his coffee, staring into it like it held answers he'd misplaced. Lila ate slowly, watching the shadows cast by the lamp flicker across the walls. But something had shifted. The house no longer felt empty. It felt haunted by 2 different stories, 2 different hurts resting under the same roof. And as Lila looked toward the closed door at the end of the hall, she understood something she hadn't before. She wasn't the only ghost living here. By the next morning, the ranch had settled into a quiet rhythm that Lila didn't quite understand. Sunlight fell warm across the porch. A cool breeze carried the faint smell of sagebrush from the hills. Somewhere in the distance, a lone hawk circled for breakfast. It should have felt peaceful, safe, even, but peace was a language her body hadn't learned yet. She moved carefully through the day, feeling her way around this strange new life like a blindfolded traveler. She began with simple things she knew wouldn't draw a raised hand or a sharp word, carrying water from the pump, washing dishes in the tin basin, sweeping the porch boards that creaked in the cold morning air. Every time she finished a task, Caleb gave a quiet nod without looking up from whatever he was fixing tack. Fence rails, tools. He never asked her to do anything, never barked an order, just said, "Thank you," as if gratitude were as natural as breathing. That alone left her uneasy. Gratitude from a man was something she didn't know what to do with. Late morning, Caleb wiped his palms on his trousers and motioned toward the barn. "Want to see the horses?" he asked. Lila hesitated. The barn's shadow stretched long and dark across the yard, swallowing sunlight at the threshold. She wasn't sure why her chest tightened at the sight, but Caleb waited. Patient, as always, giving her room to step forward on her own. She finally nodded. Inside, the air changed warmer, thicker, filled with the low sounds of animals shifting in their stalls. Horses snorted softly, stamping hooves, tossing their heads as if greeting her. Dust floated like tiny gold flecks in the beams of light cutting through cracks in the roof. Caleb moved slow, deliberate. "This here's Bramble," he said, patting the neck of a chestnut mare. "She's bossy, but she'll follow you like a dog once she likes you." Lila touched the rough board of the stall, staying far from the animal's reach. He led her down the row. The horses breathed steam into the cool barn air. Caleb's voice stayed soft, almost soothing, like he was talking to both her and the horses at once. "And that one's Dusty, old as sin, stubborn as everything else. Don't let him fool you. He'll try to eat your hat if you get too close." A faint smile touched her lips. Barely, but it was the first since she'd arrived. Caleb bent to check a loose shoe on one of the geldings and reached for a hammer. "Gonna tap this back in. Might be loud," he warned. She nodded, not thinking much of it until the hammer came down. The sharp, ringing sound snapped through the barn like a gunshot, and Lila's world exploded. Her breath vanished. Her hands flew to her ears. The walls seemed to tilt, the stalls closing in that instant. She wasn't in Caleb's barn at all. She was by the dry wash again, surrounded by men laughing too loudly, the taste of dust in her mouth, the bite of rope cutting her wrists raw. A horse reared somewhere behind her, hooves slamming the ground. Someone grabbed her arm. Someone whispered something she still couldn't forget. The bucket she'd been carrying clattered to the dirt. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a stall. The mare inside jerked her head at the sudden movement, and Lila nearly collapsed into the corner, covering her ears. Shaking hard, Caleb froze. He didn't reach for her, didn't step forward. He simply opened both palms and lowered his voice until it was barely more than breath. "You're all right," he murmured. "Nobody's touching you. Not here." His voice drifted toward her like a rope thrown across a river, something to hold on to, not something to drag her. Lila sucked in ragged breaths, each one sharper than the last. Her vision blurred. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might break free. She tried to speak. Only fragments came. He sold me before." Caleb didn't move. He just waited. Lila pressed the back of her head against the stall wall, eyes squeezed shut as if she could trap the memories behind them. "Not just to you," she choked out. "To men out past the wash, months ago. Traded me for a roan and a silver watch." The words fell from her like stones. A flash hit her, a campfire, whiskey breath, a hand over her mouth, men arguing about who got which turn, the sickening sound of coins exchanging hands. Her stomach lurched. Caleb's jaw tightened, not with anger at her, but at the truth he was hearing. His eyes hardened in a way she hadn't seen before. Not unkind, protective. Still, he stayed where he was. "You don't owe me the rest of that story," he said softly. "Not a single piece you're not ready to give." She lowered her hands slowly, breath calming by inches. He added, "But when you're ready, I'll listen." The barn went silent again, just the quiet munching of hay, the steady rhythm of a mare's breathing, the distant wind brushing the rafters. Lila steadied herself on the edge of the stall, her fingers trembling against the wood. Caleb waited until she nodded, letting him know she could stand alone again. He didn't ask if she was fine. She liked that about him. Later, back in the small room he'd given her, she lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where moonlight cut thin shapes across the boards. Her body still hummed with leftover fear, but beneath it, something else stirred, something softer, something unfamiliar. For the first time in years, she wondered if speaking her truth out loud might loosen the chains she carried. And maybe, just maybe, this quiet ranch, haunted by its own ghosts, was a place where her voice could finally start to matter. The next week brought a quiet stretch of days, long enough that the shape of life on the ranch began to settle around Lila like a coat she wasn't sure she fit into. She swept floors, fed chickens, folded laundry. Caleb fixed fences, mended tools, and rode the far edge of the property checking for coyote tracks. They spoke only when needed. But the silence was no longer sharp, just steady. On the 5th morning, Caleb wiped dust from his forearm and glanced toward the tack shed. "Need to ride into town," he said. "Stores run dry of sugar and nails. Could use more lamp oil, too." Lila froze with the dishcloth in her hand. Town, people, eyes. He must have seen the hesitation pull tight across her shoulders, because he added softly, "You can stay here if you'd rather. Door locks. You'll be safe." A month ago, she would have taken the offer without a second thought, but something in her had begun to settle these last days, not comfortably, but less like a hunted thing. "I'll go," she said, surprising herself. Caleb didn't question it, just nodded and saddled the horses. They rode out near mid-morning, the sun still low enough to cast long gold shadows across the sagebrush. The small white chapel on the hill appeared first, its paint peeling, cross-crooked. A few wooden grave markers leaned behind it, whispering to each other in the wind. Lila looked away. They passed the blacksmith's shop next. The clang of metal against metal echoed down the street and into her ribs. But she kept her breathing steady this time. Caleb flicked a glance up at her, but said nothing. The general store sat at the far end of Dry Creek, its sign half faded, windows reflecting the bright sky. Caleb dismounted first. He tied his horse to the rail, then reached up to steady Lila as she slid down. Her boots hit the ground. Dust puffed up around her ankles. Inside, the store smelled of coffee grounds, cured leather, and old wood. Conversations, two ranchers arguing over tobacco. A woman pricing flour dimmed the second they stepped over the threshold. Morning. Caleb said to no one in particular. A few nods answered. Mrs. Baxter, the store owner's wife, stood behind the counter, weighing bolts of cloth. She was a stout woman with a sharp chin and a sharper tongue. Her eyes landed on Lila, like a dart finding its mark. "Well," she said, folding her arms, "so you're the girl Jed Crowley traded off." Lila felt her stomach drop. Heat crawled up her neck. "Folks talk?" "You know, Mrs." Baxter added, leaning forward like she intended to prod. Lila's throat tightened. The room seemed too bright. Caleb's voice cut through the quiet like a blade made of still water. Sharp, but not raised. Folks talk when they've got nothing better to do, he said. We need flour, sugar, coffee. That's all. Mrs. Baxter huffed through her nose, but she moved aside. Layla kept her eyes on the shelves, willing her hands not to shake. She could feel the whispers behind her, the soft hum of curiosity, judgment, pity, the weight of every person who'd ever looked at her and seen something to trade, not someone to know. Caleb loaded supplies into a canvas sack, his motions calm, practiced. He didn't rush her toward the door, didn't shield her, didn't let her drown either. At the far end of the store, near a small table of herbs and salves, an older woman sorted dried leaves into little paper packets. Her braid was silver gray, tied with a bit of twine, eyes bright as flint, but kinder than most. Miss Alma Reeves, Dry Creek's midwife, unofficial healer, and, by rumor, the only woman in town nobody dared talk over. When Lila passed, Alma looked up. Their eyes met. She didn't stare, didn't size her up, didn't pity her. She just nodded once, like greeting someone whose name she already knew. Caleb paid at the counter. As they stepped outside, Lila exhaled shakily, not realizing she'd been holding her breath inside. At the watering trough near the hitching post, Alma Reeves stepped forward. "You're Lila Hart," she said, in a voice warm as bread right out of the oven. Lila flinched a little at hearing her name spoken kindly. "Yes, ma'am," she managed. Alma leaned her elbows on the trough's edge. "They'll call you what they want, child. They always do. But you're not Jed Crowley's trade, and you're not this town's whisper." Lila blinked. A knot rose in her throat. "You're a person," Alma said gently. "Remember that when it gets loud." Caleb paused a few paces away, giving them privacy without leaving. Alma lowered her voice. "Men like Crowley, they forget. Horses die. Money runs out. Folks move on. But the ones they hurt." She pressed her palm lightly to Lila's shoulder. "We remember. We endure." For a moment, the world steadied. No shame, no whispers, just truth. Alma tucked a small packet of herbs into Lila's hand. "For the nerves, brew it at night. And if you ever need a place to come, my door's open." Lila swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you." "Good girl," Alma said, patting her arm. "Go on now." On the ride home, the wind picked up, brushing the dust behind them like a long sigh from the land. Lila sat a little straighter in the saddle, shoulders not fully squared, but no longer curled inward either. Caleb noticed, didn't say anything, but the corner of his mouth tugged upward, like maybe he saw more than he let on. The ranch came into view again, quiet and plain against the red hills, and somewhere deep inside Lila's chest, something small and stubborn flickered to life. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of defiance, a spark that whispered, "Maybe I am more than what they've called me." The cold front rolled in without warning, sweeping down from the northern rim like a gray curtain drawn across the land. Wind rattled the shutters. The temperature dropped so fast, even the horses stamped uneasily in their stalls, snorting clouds of white into the dark. Inside the house, the stove glowed orange. Coffee simmered soft and low, filling the air with its bitter comfort. For the first time since she'd been brought here, Lila found herself staying close to the warmth. Grateful for the steadiness of it, Caleb came in from splitting kindling, shaking frost from his sleeves. "Wind's mean tonight," he muttered, hanging his coat on the peg. "We'll stay in." Lila nodded. There wasn't much else to say. Supper was simple stew, warmed over the stove, a heel of bread, coffee poured into tin cups. The lamplight softened everything. It touched the edge of the table. the steam from the bowls, the tired lines around Caleb's eyes. Outside, the storm groaned against the walls like some old spirit trying to be let in. They ate quietly, listening to the wind. After a long stretch of silence, Lila set down her spoon and folded her hands, knuckles pale. Her voice, when it came, was thin as thread. "How did you end up alone out here?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, stared into his coffee for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, as though bracing against something long buried. "That's a long story," he said. "I don't mind," she whispered. So he told it not in a straight line, not with the cadence of a man used to sharing, but in pieces, as if each memory had to be lifted up from the bottom of a well. "I married young," he began. June was her name, soft-spoken girl. Played the pump organ at the chapel every Sunday. Music made her happy, made the whole place feel lighter. A faint smile touched his mouth, there and gone like candle smoke. Our boy, Thomas, followed me everywhere. Wanted to ride before he could walk. That carved horse you found, he used to take it to bed with him. Lila swallowed, her throat tight. Caleb's eyes drifted toward the closed door at the end of the hall. Then a fever came through the territory. Hit fast, hit hard. By the time spring came, his voice cracked, barely noticeable, but Lila felt it like a shift in the air. I was the only one left. The wind howled outside, pushing against the shutters as if grieving with him. "I stayed on the ranch," he said quietly. "Didn't know where else to go. But the house feels like a tomb most days." Lila stared into her cup, watching a thin line of steam curl upward. Her hands trembled around the metal rim. She'd never heard a man speak like that, not raw, not honest, not without trying to twist the truth into something easier. Maybe that was why the next words came tumbling out before she could stop them. "Jed took me in after my mama died," she said he'd look after me. Her fingers tightened around her cup. "But he didn't," she continued, voice breaking around the edges. "I worked from dawn to dark, washing, hauling water, cooking, everything, and when cards took his money, and drink took the rest of his sense." Her breath hitched. "He started renting me out. Said a girl my age could earn her keep." Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. Lila stared past him, into the dark corner of the room, as if the memories lived there. "One night, months ago, he traded me out by the dry wash. 2 drifters, gave them me for a roan horse and a silver pocket watch." The room seemed to shrink. Her breath came shorter. She saw flashes, the firelight flickering across sneering faces, whiskey breath hot against her cheek, a hand over her mouth, the weight of dirt beneath her knees. She dug her nails into her palm, trying to stay present. After a long, terrible moment, Caleb spoke quiet but firm. "He didn't rent you." Lila looked up sharply. Caleb's voice grew stronger, like he needed her to hear every word. "He sold you. Same as selling a horse, or a mule, or a thing." He leaned forward. "That's slavery. Lila, that's wrong, and none of it is on you." Her breath left her in a rush. Nobody had ever said that to her. Not once. Not even close. Every whisper, every look back in town, every muttered judgment had put the blame squarely on her shoulders that she must have asked for it, deserved it, earned it somehow. But Caleb said it like truth. Simple, undeniable. Lila's chin trembled. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. A single tear slipped down her cheek, then another. She covered her face with her hands, ashamed of the sound in her throat, not a cry, not a sob, just a quiet breaking, a loosening of something wound, too tight for too long. Caleb didn't touch her, didn't move his chair closer. He just sat there in the lamplight, steady as an anchor, letting her fall apart without fear of being struck down for it. The room held them, two ghosts, two scars, two stories laid bare between the steam of coffee and the hum of wind. After a while, her breathing steadied. She lowered her hands slowly, eyes swollen, cheeks damp. It was the first time anyone had named her suffering without blaming her for it. The lamp flickered, throwing warm light across the table. Outside, the storm pressed at the house like a restless memory. But inside, for the first time, Lila didn't feel entirely alone with hers. The days that followed fell into a rhythm so gentle, it almost startled them both. Morning chores, coffee on the stove, Lila sweeping the steps while Caleb checked fence lines. He'd pass by with an armful of kindling and mutter something like, "Bramble kicked the bucket again," and she'd answer with a tiny smile she didn't realize she'd let slip. They shared meals in a silence that wasn't heavy anymore, just quiet in the way of two people who'd lived through too much noise. Sometimes she surprised herself by making a small joke, soft as a feather, and sometimes he surprised himself by laughing at it, a low das, rusty sound like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but it was something shaped like the beginning of it. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Caleb was splitting fence rails near the corral when he stopped suddenly. Axe frozen mid-swing, his eyes narrowed toward the far ridge, where the sky shimmered in the heat. "You see that?" he asked. Lila shaded her eyes with her hand. At first she saw only the wavering line of red rock against the pale sky. Then she noticed it, a thin, needle-like column of smoke rising straight up into the air. Just a sliver. Too thin for a campfire, too far from any homestead. In the west, smoke could mean a brush fire or trouble. Usually trouble. Caleb wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. 5 miles out. Maybe, he murmured. Could be nothing. Could be something. He saddled his gelding with brisk, practiced movements. Lila watched him, heart picking up in her chest. Something about that smoke tugged at a place she didn't have a name for, a deep, old ache that didn't feel like hers alone. "I'm coming," she said. Caleb paused mid-buckle. "Layla, it could be dangerous. I know." Her voice didn't shake. "I'm still coming." He studied her a moment long enough that she wondered if he'd refuse. But he only nodded, slow and thoughtful, and helped her mount. They rode out side by side, horses kicking up small puffs of dust as they crossed the open range. The wind carried the faint smell of sage and something else, something hotter, sharper. Smoke. They followed the trail down dry washes carved by years of storms, up low hills where the ground cracked like old leather, and through mesquite thickets rattling in the breeze. The closer they got, the stronger the tang of burned wood filled the air. After nearly an hour, Caleb drew the horse to a stop at the edge of a ravine. There, he said, at the bottom, lay what was left of a wagon, its frame blackened, wheels warped, canvas burned away. Embers still glowed under the collapsed wood, sending up thin spirals of smoke that stung Lila's eyes. She slid down from the saddle slowly, boots crunching in the ash. The silence around them felt wrong, too still, too expectant. Caleb crouched beside the wreckage, running fingers through the powdery remains. Fire wasn't more than an hour old. He murmured, "Maybe less." Lila wrapped her arms around herself against a creeping shiver. She looked around the site, noticing things without knowing why they mattered. Wheel tracks heading west, boot prints circling the wagon, drag marks in the dirt, something heavy pulled away from the fire, a knot tightened behind her eyes, a strange, sharp pressure as if some memory tried to force its way back through. Caleb noticed her stillness. "You all right?" She opened her mouth to answer and froze. A scrap of cloth fluttered from a mesquite branch above the ravine. Small, pale, edges charred, she stepped toward it slowly, aware of every breath. Her fingers brushed the fabric, soft, almost silky, faded blue with a faint stitched pattern. A baby's blanket. Her chest seized. A sudden pain shot behind her temples, so sharp she staggered. Her vision flashed white, then images surged through her like a river breaking its banks. A baby crying, warm weight in her arms, dust blowing across a wash. A man shouting, "Take the child hands," dragging her back, smoke, fear, a wagon burning. A baby's cry swallowed by wind. Her breath came shallow, fast. She choked out. There was a baby. Caleb straightened sharply. What Lila held, the blanket scrapped to her chest, shaking. I was there. I remember the fire. Not here, but like this. I held. She gasped as another shard of memory sliced through her. I held a baby. Someone was screaming. Someone wanted her knees nearly buckled, but Caleb grabbed her elbow gently, steadying her without crowding her. Easy, he murmured. Breathe, Lila. She stared at the blanket scrap, heart pounding. The memory was jagged, incomplete, but real, terrifyingly real. This ain't coincidence, Caleb said quietly, eyes dark and serious. Someone burned this wagon, and you remember one just like it. She nodded, trembling. He tucked the scrap carefully into his saddlebag. We're heading back. This needs time to make sense. The ride home was silent, not heavy, just full, the kind of silence that carried questions too big to speak aloud. The hills grew long shadows as they rode. The air cooled. The ranch came into view in the fading light, small and fragile against the vastness around it. But nothing felt the same. Not the rhythm of the horses, not the air between them, not the land itself. Something had been stirred up, something that had waited in the dark too long. Lila pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the faint echo of a memory she'd lost and feared to find again. A baby, a fire, her own voice screaming, and she knew. With a certainty that chilled her. This was only the beginning, at first light, before Lila had even pulled on her boots. Caleb was already out at the corral saddling the gelding. Steam lifted from the animal's nostrils as the cold dawn pressed against the land. The horizon glowed faint pink, like it wasn't sure it wanted to birth another day. Lila stepped onto the porch, rubbing her arms against the chill. Caleb didn't look up. He simply jerked his chin toward the hills. We're riding back to the wagon, he said. Better tracks in morning light. She nodded. She didn't need to be asked twice. They rode in silence, hooves kicking frost from brittle grass. The world still felt half asleep. Even the birds seemed hesitant, calling only once or twice, as if testing the day. When they reached the ravine, the burned wagon looked worse in daylight. Charcoal bones, warped spokes, ash drifting in thin gray piles. Something about seeing it under a fresh sky made the horror of it clearer, not distant, but deliberate. Caleb swung down from his saddle and crouched. The man changed when he studied ground, quieter, sharper. Like some part of his old cavalry training woke back up. 3 horses, he murmured. 1 big draft, or near enough. 2 lighter mounts. He traced one print with his finger. Heavy load on this one. Drag marks here. Someone was pulled. or something. Lila wrapped her coat tighter. The morning cold got into her bones, here, among the ashes. Which way did they go? She whispered. Caleb pushed his hat back slightly as he studied the tracks. North, he said, toward Fort Ransom. Lila swallowed. The memory of the baby's cry, faint, flickering, broken, fluttered behind her ribs like a trapped bird. She closed her eyes and felt it again, warm weight. Small hands, dust, smoke, panic. Why would anyone go toward a fort, she asked. Caleb stood slowly. Because traders think uniforms don't look too close at things that ain't their business. And sometimes they're right. He mounted up, she followed, and they rode north. Fort Ransom sat on a low rise overlooking the valley, its walls made of thick, sun-faded timber. A flag hung limp on the pole, edges worn to threads. A few soldiers lounged by the barracks, coats half-buttoned, boots dusty. One man smoked a cigarette, letting the smoke drift lazily over the parade ground where a few horses stamped their hooves in boredom. The fort looked tired, old, like everyone inside it had survived too many winters and too few victories. Caleb dismounted and motioned for Lila to stay near the horses. Sergeant Hale's still posted here, he said. He served under me for a spell. Lila watched from a few paces behind as Caleb approached the blockhouse. A gruff voice barked out before the door even opened. Well, I'll be damned. Caleb Roarke, a stocky man with gray along his temples, stepped out, adjusting his suspenders. His face was creased with the kind of lines earned from too much sun and too many orders given. Sergeant Hale, Caleb said with a nod. Didn't expect to find you still breathing. Hale barked a laugh. Someone's got to keep this place from falling apart. His smile faded when he saw Lila, small and stiff beside the horses. He tipped his hat respectfully, then looked back to Caleb. What brings you? Caleb didn't waste words. Burned wagons south of here. Fresh tracks heading north. Hale's jaw worked. We heard something about that 2 days back. Scout reported smoke, but by the time he got there, whatever happened was over. Lila stepped closer before she realized she was moving. Do you know who did it? Hale hesitated, then sighed, lowering his voice. There's talk along the stage routes, he said. A ring of traders, moving quiet through the territory, claim they're escorting servants, orphans, folks needing work, to mining towns. Lila felt her stomach turn. Hale continued, but some of those girls look too scared. Some of the little ones, too small to travel like that. Caleb's expression hardened into something just shy of anger. What about the wagon, he asked. The sergeant scratched the back of his neck. Couple riders saw a group near the old Silver Hollow Road. Said one woman was carrying a bundle that cried. Lila's heart stopped. A baby, she whispered. Hale looked at her, saw something in her face, and softened. Yeah. Scout said she was dark-haired, blue dress, looked lost. The world tilted, her breath caught, her vision blurred around the edges. I wore a blue dress, she whispered. Before Jed. Her voice broke. She pressed a hand to her mouth as another memory fragment stabbed through her. Someone pulling a baby from her arms, shouting, Go take the child. Caleb stepped to her side. Steady, but not touching. Hale watched them both, confusion knitting his brow. You know that wagon? Girl? Lila shook her head, not in denial, but in ache, not fully. But I remember the fire, and a baby. Someone took them. Hale exhaled, long and tired, If that's true, then the child might still be alive. That group headed toward Silver Hollow, last we heard. A tremor moved through Lila, from the base of her spine to the back of her throat. If there's a chance, she whispered, any chance, we have to go. Caleb didn't look at Hale, didn't look at the fort. He looked only at her, at the raw determination in her eyes, the kind born from pain and something fiercer than fear. He nodded once. This ain't just about decency anymore, he said. It's about making sure nobody else gets traded off or burned up in a wagon, because men like Crowley think they can. Hale's voice turned grave. Silver Hollow's dangerous. Abandoned mine. Rough country. You'll be chasing men who don't leave witnesses. Caleb put his hand on the saddle horn. Then we best make sure we ain't witnesses. Lila tightened her grip on the reins. Her heart beat so loud she could hear it in her ears. A baby's cry echoed faintly in her memory, like a ghost waking up. They mounted. Without another word, they turned their horses toward the North Trail, where the hills grew harsher and the land forgot to be kind. And somewhere ahead, maybe close, maybe far, was a child who once reached for her with tiny hands. The wind cut sharp across her cheek. Everything had changed. Everything. Silver Hollow wasn't a town. It wasn't even a mine anymore. Not in the way men meant when they talked of work and wages. It was a scar on the land, a deep wound, carved into red rock, where the earth had been scraped raw for iron and silver until nothing good remained. By the time Caleb and Lila reached the ridge overlooking it, night had settled hard. A thin crescent moon hung low, barely strong enough to light the jagged cliffs. Down below, torches flickered like angry fireflies, throwing long, broken shadows across the collapsed shafts and rusted ore carts. Lord, Caleb murmured. Place looks worse than I remember. A cold wind slid through Lila's coat, making her shiver. Silver Hollow felt wrong the moment her boots hit the ground like the air was holding its breath. Far off, she heard the clang of metal, men's voices, a horse pawing at the dirt. This wasn't a mine. It was a holding pen. Caleb crouched beside her, eyes scanning the lights. We wait for the watch change. Cavalry camps had the same problem men get sloppy during shift switch. Lila nodded. Her hands trembled, despite her efforts to steady them. The memory fragments had grown sharper since Fort Ransom. The baby's weight, the firelight, the cry, but nothing clear enough to say whose child it was, or where they'd gone. The ridge was cold, silent except for wind brushing dry grass. Caleb studied the guards, counted their steps, their lantern swings, their lazy pacing. When the moment came, a short gap between two patrols, he touched Lila's sleeve. Now. They moved low along the hillside, each step slow, careful. Gravel slipped under their boots. Lila clenched her jaw, praying the sound didn't carry. Her nerves buzzed like rattlesnakes, shaking inside her chest. Below them, two canvas tents sat near a cluster of torches. A pot simmered on a fire. A mule dozed, head low, tail flicking at the occasional fly. Music drifted from somewhere deeper in the mine men, drinking, laughing, playing cards with the kind of ease that came only when power tilts hard in one direction. Caleb motioned toward the tents. Sounded like a baby before Lila swallowed. Yes. They crept nearer, hugging the shadows. The closer they got, the louder the muffled fussing became a tiny, restless whimper mixed with soft, hushing words. Caleb lifted the tent flap an inch, no noise from inside. Then a faint voice. Please, whoever you are, don't hurt us. Caleb opened the flap wider. Inside, a woman in her 30s sat cross-legged on a blanket, a baby girl in her lap. The woman's eyes were wide, ringed with exhaustion, her hair tangled, clothes stained with travel and fear. The child, maybe 8 or 9 months old, whimpered softly, cheeks flushed from crying. Lila stepped inside before she realized she'd moved. Her heart hammered as she knelt, reaching toward the baby with gentle hands. "It's all right," she whispered. "We're not with them. We're here to help." The woman sagged with relief, pressing a shaking palm over her eyes. "They took us from a farm near the San Pedro Road. Said they'd find work for me. Said the baby would be placed where she'd be appreciated. Lies. All of it." Caleb's jaw clenched. "You're leaving with us. Tonight." The woman nodded quickly, clutching her child tighter. Lila reached for the baby, lifting her slowly. The child fussed once, then settled against her shoulder, small fingers curling into Lila's collar. A jolt ran through her, warmth, a memory of weight, a desperate cry from another night. She studied the baby's face, round cheeks, big brown eyes, soft wisps of hair. "Do I know you?" She whispered, not to the woman, not to Caleb, but to the child. The baby blinked sleepily. Lila waited for something, a pull in her chest, a flash of recognition, the sense of a bond remembered. Nothing came. Her heart folded in on itself. Caleb watched her carefully. "Lila," she shook her head, voice trembling. "She's not mine. The child I held, that night, it wasn't my own. She belonged to another woman, someone who begged me to take him when her breath hitched. When the shooting started, the woman looked at her with sympathy, but fear kept her questions tucked away." Caleb touched Lila's elbow lightly. "We'll figure it out. Let's get them out first." They slipped through the camp shadows, using the rocky terrain for cover, following an old dry creek bed that wound around the mine. Caleb went first, scanning every ridge and hollow, and Lila followed with the baby tucked close, the woman behind her, clutching a small cloth bag. They were nearly clear of the last torch when a voice barked, "Hey, who's there?" A guard stepped forward, pistol lifted halfway. Caleb turned slow, palms open. Easy now. No need for the guard lunged. Caleb moved faster. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted hard, sending the pistol skidding across the dirt. The guard swung with his free hand, but Caleb dodged, knocked him back against a boulder, and pressed an arm against his chest. Lila held her breath, baby pressed tight to her shoulder. The woman stifled a gasp. Caleb leaned in, voice low and cold. "You tell your bosses the territory's watching now. You tell them folks are missing, and we're not looking the other way." His grip tightened. "And if you've got any sense left, you'll quit before someone else doesn't walk away from a warning." The guard swallowed hard, nodding frantically. Caleb shoved him aside and motioned for the others. "Move!" They rode out, under the thin moonlight, dust rising behind them in faint clouds. The woman held her child tighter every mile. Lila rode silently, the wind tugging her hair, the emptiness in her chest widening with every hoofbeat. She had saved a baby, a mother, 2 lives pulled back from the fire, and yet the hole inside her remained, dark and unanswered. The memory of the real child, the one she'd held during the flames, pulsed faintly, painfully. Somewhere out there, a baby boy still cried in the dark, and she had no idea where to begin looking. Word in the Arizona territory traveled faster than water, faster than wind, sometimes faster than bullets. By the time Caleb and Lila brought the rescued woman and her baby back to Dry Creek, tongues were already wagging. Folks lined the storefronts, whispering as they passed. Roarke brought back strays again. Someone muttered, "Heard he saved a child." Another said, "Or stirred up trouble we didn't need." Trouble or not, the baby lived, and her mother clung to Caleb's hand as if she'd found a piece of the world still worth trusting. The town watched them like a sermon they couldn't look away from. The woman was taken in by Miss Alma Reeves, who wasted no time in settling her and the baby in a back room with warm blankets, tea, and the kind of firm gentleness only she possessed. And for a few weeks, life felt steady again. Lila swept the porch in the mornings, fed the chickens, and learned to saddle her own horse. Caleb repaired the barn roof, fixed the squeak in the back door, and even started playing the old pump organ some nights slow, uneven notes he didn't seem to realize she listened to from the hallway. The land felt gentle for a while, the ghosts quieter. But the west had a way of bringing storms long after the sky looked clear. It happened on a blistering afternoon, the kind where every breath tasted like dust. Dry Creek lay half asleep in the heat when 3 riders pushed into town, coats flapping, spurs jangling, arrogance rolling off them like smoke. The first rider was stocky, wide-jawed, and sober in a way that made him more dangerous, not less. Jed Crowley. Behind him rode 2 hired gun hands, the kind who kept their eyes half-lidded and their hands near the butts of their pistols. Jed swung off his horse outside the saloon, boots thudding hard on the ground. He shoved the door open, letting it slam behind him. "That man's trouble. Old Mr." Whitcomb muttered on the boardwalk. Inside, Jed slapped a stack of papers onto the bar. "I'm here to take back what's mine," he barked. Girl ran off. "I got legal claim bound to me for debts unpaid." The saloon went quiet, except for the lazy creak of the ceiling fan. Sheriff Mullins, nursing a lukewarm beer, rubbed his tired eyes. "Jed, we ain't doing this today." "Oh, we're," Jed hissed. "I got witnesses. I got signed papers. That girl owes me years of service. You can't hide her under Rourke's roof. Law meant something different out here. Sometimes it bent like a sapling in high wind. Sometimes it broke. Jed knew that, and he counted on it. Back at the ranch, a rider thundered in with news. Caleb tightened his jaw. He didn't waste a second saddling the gelding. Lila stepped out onto the porch. Breath caught in her throat. "It's him, isn't it?" Caleb didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I'm coming. You don't have to." "Yes," she said, voice steady as flint. "I do." He met her eyes. Whatever he saw there, fear, courage, something sharpened by weeks of healing, made him nod. They rode together. Down the dusty road, past the chapel, past the grave markers, leaning into the wind, into a town holding its breath. The saloon doors swung under Caleb's hand, creaking like an old wound. Inside, Jed stood in the center of the room, bragging, ranting, waving papers like a badge of ownership. "My girl," taken from me. Lila stepped forward. The room froze. "I'm not your anything. Jed Crowley," she said, voice shaking but loud enough to reach every corner. "Not your girl. Not your debt. Not your property. Not now. Not ever again." Jed turned, eyes narrowing. "You watch your mouth." She didn't flinch. She didn't look at the gun hands. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at Jed, the man who'd stolen her life one day at a time and convinced her she deserved it. "You want to tell them?" she said softly. "Or should I?" The room tensed. Lila lifted her chin. "Tell them how you used me as labor after my mama died. Tell them how you rented me out to your drinking friends. Tell them how you traded me to 2 drifters for a roan horse and a silver watch." Tell them how you sold me for a bay gelding like I was a mule with a broken leg. Gasps rippled across the room. A few men looked at their boots. One set his whiskey glass down slowly, shame burning through him. Mrs. Baxter, who'd judged her weeks ago, turned pale. Sheriff Mullins straightened, his jaw tightening. Jed, is any of that true? Jed sneered. She's a liar. A little weep. His hand moved, fast, toward the gun at his hip, but Caleb moved faster. Steel rasped as his revolver cleared its holster, pointed straight at Jed's chest, arm steady, eyes cold. Don't, Caleb said. Just one word. Quiet. Deadly. Jed froze, fury twisting his face. The two gun hands shifted. A scrape of boots echoed against the walls. Fingers tapped near triggers. The air thickened full of dust, sweat, fear, and something like justice gathering at the edges. Sheriff Mullins stood slowly, hand hovering near his own holster. He looked from Caleb to Jed to the shaken crowd, and finally to Lila. He had to choose law as written or law as lived. The kind that could save a woman's life in a land that didn't care much for saving. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Nobody breathed, and the whole room waited to see which gun would fire first. The silence in the saloon stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Sheriff Mullins stood there, jaw set, one hand hovering above his holster. Jed Crowley seethed, spit gathering at the corner of his mouth, fingers just inches from his gun. Caleb kept his revolver trained on Jed's chest, steady as a ranch post in a storm. Finally, the sheriff spoke. Jed Crowley, he said, voice gravel deep. I'm placing you under arrest for unlawful trafficking, assault, and whatever else comes to light when folks start talking. A murmur rippled across the room. Some men nodded, others looked away as if ashamed of the years they'd stayed silent. Jed's eyes went wild. You ain't arresting me. She's lying. The whole damn town knows she enough, Mullins barked. He stepped forward to grab Jed's arm. That's when everything snapped. Jed jerked away, slammed his elbow into the sheriff's ribs, and shouted, "Get him!" Boys. His gun hands moved instantly. Pistols flashing. Gunfire erupted. Bottles shattered behind the bar. Glass spraying across the counter. Patrons dove under tables. Chairs crashed. Someone screamed. Caleb shoved Lila behind a pillar, shielding her with his body as bullets tore through the saloon's front windows. Jed scrambled through the chaos, firing at shadows, pushing past stunned men to reach the doors. Crowley's running, someone yelled. Damn fools heading toward the chapel hill. Caleb didn't waste a second. He grabbed Lila's wrist and pulled her toward the exit. I'm coming, she gasped. I know. He said, no hesitation, no argument. Outside, Jed and his men were already galloping hard, dirt kicking up behind them as they thundered toward the low hill just outside town, the one crowned by the little whitewashed chapel and its leaning grave markers. The sheriff and two townsmen followed at a distance, firing warning shots. Caleb leaped onto his gelding, hissing when his still tender ribs protested. Lila mounted behind him before he could tell her otherwise, hands gripping his coat tight as they tore up the dusty slope. The sun beat down mercilessly, heat shimmered off the dry ground. The chapel bell clanged softly in the wind, like it was warning them or praying for them. Halfway up the hill, the gun hands spun in their saddles and opened fire. A bullet sang past Lila's ear. Another carved splinters off the chapel's wooden steps. Caleb veered behind a cluster of scrub brush and grave markers. On foot, he barked, sliding off the gelding. Lila followed, boots skidding on the loose dirt. Gunfire echoed across the ridge, and sharp, ugly bursts. Then a single crack split the air. Caleb grunted, staggered, and collapsed to one knee, hand clamped over his shoulder. Blood seeped fast between his fingers. Lila dropped beside him, panic rising like floodwater. He sucked in a breath, teeth clenched. "I'm all right. Just keep low." Jed stepped out from behind a mesquite tree, gun aimed straight at Caleb's head. His face was twisted with rage, sweat shining on his brow. "You think you can take what's mine," he snarled. "That horse was worth more than she'll ever be." Lila froze. Those words, those exact words, the same venom he'd used the night he traded her away. Caleb tried to raise his gun, but his arm trembled, too weak from blood loss. Jed cocked his hammer, and something inside Lila broke clean open. She saw it all in a flash. The night by the wash, the rope digging into her wrists, the laughter, the fear, the fire, the baby she tried to save, every time she froze, every time she kept silent, every moment she was made to believe she was nothing more than a trade. Not anymore. Caleb's rifle lay in the dirt a few feet away, knocked from his hand when he fell. Lila crawled toward it, fingers shaking. Jed didn't notice, too focused on his kill. She wrapped her hands around the rifle's stock, lifting the weight of it, like lifting her own name out of the ashes. "Jed Crowley," she shouted across the hill, voice echoing off the chapel walls. Jed whipped around. Lila stood there, trembling, breathless, eyes burning but standing. "You don't get to decide my worth," she said, each word rising stronger. "Not anymore." She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the air with the clarity of a verdict. Jed screamed, dropping his pistol as blood sprayed from his wrist. He fell backward, clutching his hand, cursing Lila's name through clenched teeth. More gunshots sounded behind them, the sheriff and 2 townsmen cresting the hill, rifles raised. "That's enough!" Sheriff Mullins roared. He stormed forward, kicked Jed's dropped gun out of reach, and slapped irons on him with a force that rattled bone. Jed's remaining gun hand tried to bolt, but a rifle butt from one of the townsmen sent him sprawling. He too was cuffed, groaning into the dirt. The hill fell silent except for Caleb's rough breathing and the wind moving through the sagebrush. Sheriff Mullins walked over to Lila, his face softer than she'd ever seen it. "You did what the law should have done a long time ago," he said. "You stood up to him." Lila lowered the rifle slowly. Her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped it. Behind her, Caleb managed a faint smile, pale from blood loss. "Told you," he rasped. "You're not property. Look at you now." Lila knelt beside him, tears blurring her vision. But she held his gaze. Steady, fierce. The gunfire had stopped. Jed was in irons. The hill was quiet again, but inside her chest, something new had begun to burn, something like truth, something like strength, something she'd never been allowed to feel before. And the echo of that fire would not fade soon. Months passed, and the Arizona territory softened into early summer. Dry Creek quieted in a way the town hadn't known for years. Folks still talked. Of course, people always did, but the whispers had lost their sharpness. Too much had happened for gossip to stay shallow. Jed Crowley sat in the makeshift holding room behind the sheriff's office, waiting for the next prison transport east. Some said he paced like a caged wolf. Others said he prayed. Lila didn't care which was true. His shadow no longer reached her. The rescued woman, Mrs. Howell, now lived with cousins in town. The baby Mary Beth toddled on unsteady legs, hands always reaching, curious about everything. Whenever Lila visited, Mary Beth made a beeline toward her, little feet slapping against wooden floors, arms open as if welcoming someone she'd known in another life. Lila always knelt to catch her, feeling something warm expand inside her chest each time. Not the ache of what she'd lost, but the healing of knowing she could still be part of someone's beginning. At the ranch, life settled into a rhythm, both familiar and new. Caleb's shoulder had mostly healed, though it still stiffened during cold mornings. He'd mutter about the weather, rotating his arm slowly, testing its limits. Lila pretended not to see him wince sometimes, but she noticed. She always noticed. She took over much of the housework, and, surprisingly to both of them, the ranch's small records grain tallies, shoeing schedules, supply lists. Alma Reeves and the preacher spent long evenings helping her with lessons, filling in the holes left by a childhood of labor and silence. Reading came easiest. Writing took longer, but she loved both. Some days, she hummed while tending the stove. Simple tunes, soft ones, tunes she didn't know she remembered. Caleb would walk through the doorway, pause, and listen like someone hearing rain after a drought. At first, he thought the sound hurt like memory, tugging at a wound stitched but not healed. Turns out, it soothed, smoothed the edges, made the old grief something he could hold without bleeding. One evening, the sun dipped low and set the whole sky burning gold. Caleb stood at the table, staring down at a folded paper like it was something fragile. Lila was washing up when she noticed his stillness. "What is it?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He didn't speak right away, just set the paper gently on the table. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low, "about this place, about us." Lila stepped closer, heart thudding. Caleb opened the paper. It was a deed. Not new, but rewritten, amended, made whole, again. Two names were printed across the top. Caleb Roarke, Lila Hart Roarke. Her breath caught. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly awkward. "You've worked this land as much as I have. You kept this house running. You kept me going." He met her eyes, steady. "Half this place is yours, Lila. Not as a gift, not because you owe me anything, but because you've earned it." She stared at the paper, stunned. Caleb swallowed. "If you want more, if you'd ever choose it, you could stay here as my wife. If that's not what you want, stay anyway. As my partner, my equal." He paused. "Your choice, only yours." Lila didn't speak for a long moment. Her fingers brushed the edge of the deed lightly, as if afraid it would vanish. A memory flickered, a dusty yard, hands tied, Jed shouting numbers, shouting worth, shouting ownership, the horse for the girl. The first time she'd been traded. Nobody asked what she wanted. This time, the choice was hers alone. Her throat tightened. "Yes," she whispered. Caleb blinked. "To all of it," she said softly. "To the land, to the mornings, to the quiet, to this home, and," she stepped closer, touching his uninjured arm, "to you." Something eased in him, something deep, something knotted for years. His smile was small, almost shy, but real. They signed the deed together that evening, ink pooling under the lamplight, the house warm around them in a way it had never been. Later, as the sun settled behind the red hills, they stood by the corral. The sky glowed orange and lavender, clouds drifting like slow-moving cattle. Near the fence, the old bay horse cropped grass, tail swishing lazily. The same horse Caleb had traded for her, older now, back a little sway. But content, Lila reached out and stroked the gelding's neck. His coat was warm, familiar. Caleb stood beside her, watching the horizon. Funny thing, he murmured, half to himself. Best trade I ever made. She smiled, not at him, but with him. At the land, at the calm, at the future she'd chosen with her own voice. The cicadas hummed, a breeze carried the smell of mesquite and clean dust. Somewhere in town, a bell rang the hour. And in that soft twilight, the story she thought had ended years ago finally opened into a life she could step into without fear. They sold her for a horse when she was 19. She thought it was the end of her story. Turned out, it was only the first page of the life she chose for herself. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in the quiet corners of a worn-out ranch, in the warmth of a hand offered without judgment, in the gentle light of a room that finally feels like your own. Lila's journey reminds us that even when the world treats us as if we have no worth, the choice to reclaim our life and voice can come from small, steady acts of courage and trust. We learn that freedom isn't only about escaping those who would harm us. It's about finding people and places that see us fully, honoring our presence and letting us decide our path. Caleb's quiet steadiness, Alma's gentle guidance, and the simple trust that Lila allows herself to feel show that compassion has the power to heal scars left by years of fear and silence. In the end, it's not the storms we survive that define us, but the moments we stand, even just for ourselves, and claim the life we deserve. Sometimes, the smallest gestures, a shared meal, a warm coat, a key in our hand, can become the foundation for a future we choose for ourselves. And that choice, more than anything, carries the deepest meaning of all. Thank you for being here with us. Your time, your attention, and your heart mean more than words can say. Every like, every share, every subscribe helps us keep these forgotten stories alive, stories of courage, hope, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Every gesture, no matter how small, is a way of spreading kindness and remembering the lives that once whispered in the dust. Thank you for helping us tell more stories that touch the soul